Welcome to Data Visualization, the last unit in Management Science 113. Data visualization is a fast emerging topic because right now we are inundated with data. There is an abundance of data. And with that abundance, we need to make sense of that data. We need to figure out, what is that data telling us? What story is that data telling us? And one of the tools used to tell that story is visualization. We are a visual being. We respond to visual stimulation. Oh boy, barely said that, right? We respond to that. We see pictures, we interpret pictures very well, extremely well. And so when we are trying to communicate data to stakeholders, whoever it is that we're trying to communicate this to, we need to take that data, put it in a form such that those stakeholders, or those folks that we're trying to tell this story to, can see what's going on. That process of taking that data and turning it into something that is meaningful, that tells that story, that makes that conclusion, that shows that result, we call that information. So our goal is to turn data into information. And we do that, or one of the tools that we do that through is visualizing this data. And usually that means a graph of some sort, but it could also refer to tables as well. Okay. Now, as you embark further into your university experience, many other courses will leap into this topic of data visualization because it is a very fast emerging area. And sometimes the focus can be to start to think of the software involved in visualizing the data and taking the data and converting it into pictures. What we want to do here is just take a step back from that and think about the appropriate ways to visualize that data. What are some good things to do? What are some bad things to do? What are some fundamental principles that we should follow? And what are some practices that we should avoid? Okay, so we're not going to start punching stuff out on Excel or a data visualization package in this component. We're going to talk about good tools and bad tools. Now, as we go from visualizing or representing that data visually, we always have to think about who are we sort of pitching this to, right? A different audience, different set of tools, right? If you're going with talking to a bunch of economists, you flash up a table and you got them cold, right? They're like, ooh, mesmerized. But perhaps maybe for a wider audience with a wider mix of skill sets, you might want to go with a certain, a more graph solution, if you will. Okay, so you need to know who your audience is. How deep you dive into that data also depends on your audience. What story do you need to tell that particular audience? Also impacts which tools you use. So, for instance, the story that you're telling to finance professionals who probably more quantitatively focused might be via tables with supplementary graphs. But let's say you're talking to government officials or a general audience, then perhaps maybe you'll go with more of a visual storytelling tool. Okay, so depending on who you're talking to, depends on which tools that you use. So it's not like we use tables all the time, or we like to use bar graphs all the time, or something like that. There isn't anything like that. You are always thinking about who you're trying to tell this story to, and what story are you trying to sell, or what are you trying to tell, I guess. Okay, so we're going to keep that always in mind. Now we are going to go pick that effective visual. And again, we always think about what tool to use to show our data, right? What tool is appropriate to show this particular data to this group of people. Now, one key theme that underlies all this, is we want to avoid what's called cognitive overload. That is our enemy. Cognitive overload is just when you're just hit with just too much stuff, just too much information, too much visual, too busy a graph, too busy a table. Right? And once you do that, your brain goes whoop, 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 and overloads, and then you start to do the zone out part, right? You can't see what's in there because it's just too much to sift through. And it's just simply just too exhausting to go through all that stuff. That is our enemy, the cognitive overload. We want to avoid that. We want to keep it simple. We want to keep it focused. We want to make sure that our visual tool tells the story. We do not want to overwhelm the audience. And sometimes, I don't want to say all the time, but sometimes when you got the fancy software package with all the cool colors and all these 17,000 fonts, and you really want to use every single one of them because it's all so damn cool and it looks so freaking pretty that it's unbelievable. And then somebody looks at that and says, I have no idea what this data is telling us, but gosh darn it, that is a beautiful graph. It almost rips your heart out when that happens. You know, do you remember those times where you watched that commercial and said, that was the funniest, most entertaining commercial I've ever seen. What the heck were they selling? I got no idea. Oh man, total loss at that point, right? Great creativity, great production, no storytelling, no information conveyed. Totally useless, I'm sad to say. Okay, so some tools we have, we can just keep it to simple text. Sometimes simple works. Okay, remember, the focus is to tell the story. The focus is to convey information. If simple text works, simple text works. And we also have things, tables, and we'll talk about some best practices with tables in a moment. We have heat maps, which are kind of cool too. They work with the tables. Then there's the old favorites like line graphs and slope graphs and the old vertical bar chart that gets no doggone respect because it's so old, it's so easy to understand, it's so ubiquitous that it just seems uncreative. It doesn't get the respect it deserves because it doesn't. But on the other hand, it does an awesome job of telling the story, of conveying the information. Things we don't like. Pie charts, donut charts, area graphs, all that stuff. We don't like that. Those don't work well for us. I'll say it here. I'll say it again. Our brains do a pretty crappy job of comparing areas. And when you look at pie charts and area graphs, we're comparing one area to another area, and we just don't do a good job of it. I mean, the brain's just not wired that way for whatever reason. And pretty much anything 3D, because you can manipulate the story by via using how you use 3D. And the idea here is to convey an honest story, is to convey an honest piece of information, not to manipulate people to get a conclusion. And we want to avoid that. That's unethical. We don't want to do there. We don't want to go there. Okay. Also, when we start to think about that visual, a key idea to think about is when things are connected to each other, when there's elements in your graph that are related to each other, you want to represent those related items with consistent colors and consistent fonts. If they're different items, they can be different fonts and different colors. That's actually a good thing. But if there's some elements that are in some way unified or connected or related, and you want to illustrate that connection, that relatedness with common use of colors and fonts. Okay, let's look at a table picture. Okay, so this is a table, and this is all from the document that I've posted on Blackboard. And we start off with a graph, and let's say it looks with the heavy borders and the big grids and all that kind of stuff. And when you look at that, I mean, we could look at that right now and we see, okay, fine. But what's really bouncing out at us is the grid. the graph. The graph is bouncing, and it's kind of hard to see the story, right? So one tool to do that is you can go with lighter borders, and you can see as you go from the heavy borders to the lighter borders, the information, the data is coming out at us now. The graph is going into the background, and the data is coming out. And even with minimal borders, you can kind of see the same. Now, of course, we always keep an idea of how much we have in our particular table. So we have 5 groups here, and okay, we can kind of easily make a connection, group 4 across a certain line, group 3 across a certain line, and so on, and we can see that. If it becomes where it's a bigger graph, then perhaps you step back into the light borders because you want to sort of folks be able to follow along. And if there's too much to follow along, maybe they start jumping rows or something like that. So we're always common sense about this, right? I mean, it's a judgment thing, but we can kind of see that as we go with a more of a table minimalist structure, the data comes out at us. Now, we could put flashy colors up on this and stuff like that. The table would look absolutely beautiful. But we always have to remember what tells the story the best. Which tool conveys the data in the best manner, in the easiest manner. And typically minimalization of those tables and those grid lines and so on is the way to go. Heatmap's kind of nice. So if we take that table and we've got, let's say, a lot of data, so a little bit more data here, 6 categories, and that can be, we look at 6 times 3, that's 18 pieces of 18 numbers in there, 18 different percentages. That can be a little bit hard to start to sift through, right? How do you tell the relationship between column A in category 5 and column B in category 3, right? I mean, it starts to become a little bit busy, a little bit cluttery, a little bit of cognitive overload, which is something we really, really want to avoid. So sometimes you could use the heat map, whereas we have the colors are a little darker when it's high, a little lighter when it's low, and now you can kind of see the contrast via color, and you can perhaps read the data a little bit, but you can now see relative measurements. You can see that column A, category 5, much bigger than, let's say, column B, category 3. And column C, category 5, much bigger than column A, category 6. So we can now see some contrasts. A little bit harder, I think, to read the numbers in that case. So there's a bit of a trade-off there. But if we're trying to highlight results and comparisons and differentials in a presentation, this can be a very quick, effective tool to do that. Another tool we have, and you see this tool used when you have 2 quantitative pieces of information, and here we have how the S&P 500 index and the 10-year U.S. Treasury bond are related to each other, and you can kind of see the line, slight negative relationship, a lot of noise because the data points are far from the line, so a lot of other issues happening here as well. But this kind of tells us a general story about how two quantitative variables are related to each other. And you'll see this if you take Management Science 312. You'll do a regression, and when we have simple linear regression, this kind of scatterplot's a very useful tool. Of course, multiple linear regression gets a little bit harder. You get four-dimensional problem, and it's a challenge to graph that. / impossible. Okay, but Scatterplot's a good tool. We can kind of see the relationship with the quantitative 2 quantitative variables. We can kind of see that there's other things going, so other variables are important here. Those other variables aren't on the graph because it's limited by its 2-dimensionality, but we know that they exist by looking at the spread of the scatter. A couple of things is the old line graph. Line graphs are kind of nice, and you can kind of show relationships. You can show multiple relationships. You can even show many relationships. They're typically used to show relationships between items. Okay, so you can kind of see there's a line graph on the far right here about website sales underperformance and engagements and so on and so forth. And those are nice for showing relationships as they either relative to different other categories or over time. The one on the far right has both, right? You can kind of see the relationship between different categories as well as the relationship as those different categories move over time. And you can, like, for instance, you can see that Instagram followers from 2016, 2017 went up far more than the other groups, right? Because we can kind of see a steeper line, sort of look and see website sales were dropped. It means kind of a slope, underperforming line. We've colored them to show ones that are going up and ones are going down to give it a little bit more information. So there's lots of things that we can do there, but you can kind of see that's kind of easy to look at. We can see numbers in there, right? So if you're the number focused person, you can see the numbers. If you're a relationship focused person, you can see how things are relative to other modes and then over time. So kind of neat that way. And then, of course, the underappreciated bar graph. Underappreciated because it's been around for so stinking long that it almost gets no respect. It's the Rodney Dangerfield of graphing. It gets absolutely no respect, but it does an awesome job of telling a story. And we can kind of see here this Starbucks growth by region. We've got a couple of different regions in there, and we can see how growth rate is relative to the regions. And then we can sort of see how it's flowing over time. Color choice can be a little bit can be kind of important here. Of course, everything referring to the Americas will get a common color because they're connected to each other. It's all in the Americas. China gets its common color because, again, that's information that's connected to each other. Okay, so we can kind of see how the connected information is, and we can see how things change over time as well as change relative to each other. Now, there's a little bit of a way to kind of cheat and misuse the bar graph, and that sometimes comes down to the choice of a starting point. Okay, you choose a different starting point, and you can make that relationship look stronger than it is. And so typically, especially when you've got at the end of this a quantitative measurement, same store sales growth, that's a quantitative measurement. In that case, you want to choose 0. Because something going from 0 to 80%, 0 to 90%, those are both really strong growth rates. But if you choose 75% as your starting point, it kind of looks like that 90% is a lot, like super duper more powerful and stronger than the 80%, when in reality, 80%, 90% are both pretty high, right? So it kind of makes it look like that 90% is a bigger difference than it actually is. So there is a way to kind of cheat with the bar graph. And so we want to be very careful. And anytime you're interpreting a bar graph from someone else, look at where that starting point is. And if it's not 0, sometimes that means somebody's trying to do something sneaky, and you want to be very, very careful about that. And then let's talk about a couple of things that we don't want to do. First of all, we do not like area graphs and pie charts because our brains just aren't very good at choosing areas. 3D just makes it worse. Okay? So for instance, we look here, we see the big blue, and we see Paul looks like the sales leader on the left-hand side of the graph. Okay, awesome. Go, Paul, go. And then the right side, looks like Brian's the big winner in Q2. Go, Brian. Paul kind of slacked off. Wrong. Absolutely wrong. It's actually the same damn graph. That is exactly the same. Who we put at the forefront makes that one pop. So when they're even close to each other, right? Who's ever looking at you at the front on a 3D, especially on a 3D graph, but even on a 2D graph, we're not that good at deciphering nuance. We could put the percentages in there, but then if you're putting the percentages in there anyway, why is that better than a bar graph? Right? You're sort of telling the truth with the numbers and lying with the picture when you put the percentages on with the pie chart. Nevertheless, one part of you is kind of misleading, right? And that's not my thing. I don't like that. Okay, so again, if you want to put numbers in there, you can, and the numbers will be truthful. But your picture is still not is still a little misleading. And sometimes with some people, when they're looking at something quickly, they zone out the numbers and they focus in on the picture, and the picture will dominate. And with the picture dominating, even with the number in there, you could still be telling a misleading story. And that is something we absolutely want to avoid. Okay, couple other things that we want to consider. Clutter, clutter, clutter. We hate clutter. Clutter is bad. Clutter leads to cognitive overload. Clutter makes your brain tired. Clutter makes people zone out. Too much information, man. TMI. Well, that is entirely appropriate here in the data visualization realm. We want to avoid clutter. Clutter is bad. Clutter is bad. Clutter is bad. Clutter is bad. Keep it sleek. Make sure that it's the data that's telling the story, not the graph that is looking at as an artwork. Okay. A couple other things, 4 other things to kind of consider is the proximity, similarity, and enclosure. And this is, again, how we group common items. When we put things close to each other or things are close to each other, our brains will naturally connect them. Okay. We will see that as a group. If you are doing that on your graph, the thing you want to ask yourself is, do you intend to do that? If you didn't intend to do that, then perhaps you want to consider a different tool. Okay? If they're not really that related, but the graph is, because they're proximate to each other, is showing that, you may want to reconsider your visualization tool. Okay. Same thing with similarity. You got little squares for your little plots, or little circles for your plots, or triangles for your plots, or whatever. We will connect, our brains will connect the squares with other squares, triangles with other triangles. Is this what you intended? Is this the story you're trying to tell? If that is true, if those similar colors and those similar shapes and those similar sizes are meant to be connected to each other, fine, you're telling a good story. But if they're not, then do we want to reconsider some things? Okay, so one of the ways we do tell that story with our data is that we do have common colors for items of common items, just like we saw with that Starbucks bar graph a few moments ago. Enclosure, we group things, we close something off. Physically, we put borders around something. We will interpret that, people will interpret that as being connected to each other. Things that are within the enclosure are connected to each other. Things outside the enclosure are not. And that's just the way we perceive things. We want to make sure that if we do that, that is our intent, and that is what the data is telling us or showing us. And closure, the last item here, is you do perceive, your brain tries to look for patterns. You are a pattern seeker. You're just the way we look. We're looking for a pattern in the data. I mean, we're sort of evolutionarily set up that way, looking for patterns. And when there's missing spots in the pattern, we'll try to connect things. We'll try to fill in the gaps. We'll try to draw inferences there. Try to create a shape where we can. And with our graph, sometimes that can be good for us, and sometimes that can be bad. Again, it depends on whether that's how we wanted to tell the story. Okay, but people will start to look for connections. We want to, if that connection is intended, if the data is showing that connection, we want to make sure that our graph is set out so that connection, even when there's gaps, still comes out. And in many cases, too much clutter, too much graphical overload, it leads to cognitive overload, and then our brains don't make that connection any longer. All right, last thing, just a simple example here. Let's say we're looking at ticket volume, received versus processed. And we start off with a default Excel-like graph. And we see how the two move over time. Excel default gives them a different color. They do have different little shapes here that kind of enhance connectivity. But when we ask ourselves, do we need these big boxes and these boxes and little diamonds? Is that necessary? How about all this extra stuff around here? All these this extra information. Is it particularly necessary? So one of the first things that one can do is just, there's a border around here. Just get rid of the border. What was the point of that border? And we even go step one. Everything we put into the graph, people have to process. And again, not to really overdwell on it, but cognitive overload is a real serious problem, and it's our enemy throughout all this. So we get rid of the border around the outside, right? Already now I can I'm processing a little bit less. This looks, just even step one looks easier. It's just easier to look at. And then we go to step two. Do we need those grid lines? Are those grid lines absolutely necessary? I mean, if we really need to know whether the ticket volume processed was 127 in December, then maybe a table might be more appropriate. But here it seems like the story that we're telling is how they're different, right? How much you receive versus how much you process. And perhaps we're talking about a business issue of we're seeming to receive more than we're able to process at times. And that could be the business problem that we're trying to discuss. And if that is the business problem we're trying to discuss, then we want to look at how those two different variables, or those two different items, two different categories, how they are, where they're different, how they are contrasted with each other. And so we can maybe get rid of those grid lines. Again, kind of see the relationship a little bit more. Grid lines maybe hide it a little bit. And now we can kind of just focus clearly on just those two items. And then one of the questions one asks is, do you really need all that squares and diamonds and all that kind of stuff? And you look in step 3, you look at step 2. I think you probably don't. You could come up with a different conclusion, right? Again, considering your audience, and maybe they're shapes-oriented people. I don't know. But you sort of still see remember, the goal, the idea that we're trying to convey is that there's a difference between the two, right? Do we need the triangles and the boxes to show that there's that difference? Probably not, right? And then we kind of can clean up some of those axis labels, so you can kind of see the stuff on the bottom here. We have little grids and ticks and all this kind of stuff, and we maybe don't need those grids and ticks on the bottom. Anything cluttery, anything where people have to process more and more stuff is bad. And then we start to think, well, I got to remember blue, and then I got to look down. What does blue mean? I look red. I got to look down what red means. And every time I'm looking down, I'm looking actually away from the relationship. We want that relationship between the two items to be what's popping out at us, right? We want people to be focused only on, look at blue is different than red. We might have to do something about that. Why is blue different than red? We're concerned about the blue being different than red. Well, maybe you want to streamline the blue and the red and put a label right on the graph itself, right by the line. So when you look at the graph, you're only looking at one spot, right? You see blue, and blue is received. Red is how much we process. We already know we're talking about ticket volume. Right? Perhaps you introduced that topic. You're talking about ticket volume. So do you need the word ticket volume when you've been talking about ticket volume for the last 15 minutes? Yeah, probably extra information you don't need. Right? So now you look and you see received and processed. Okay, cool. Now I'm just looking at one thing, and I'm really focused in that. Wow, received and processed was good up until May, and then it kind of started to split apart. Why could that be? What could we do about that? This is a problem. And then step 6 is consistent color. And you make it blue, you can make it red. That one you could really have a really strong debate on. Perhaps it's harder to read non-black items. We're really trained to read text in black. Reading text in another color can maybe cause more thinking on the part of people, and the cognitive overload becomes a problem. So leaving it as black, putting it as the same color as the graph, that's probably a good idea. But again, with many of these things, really depends when you look at your presentation and you're looking it up on the screen and thinking, does the blue get lost? Does the red get lost? Does the black pop out better? I mean, we look at lines and we see a lot of blue, we see a lot of red. Our brains have connected any kind of maybe fuzziness of the projector together on the line, because that's the way we look at things. And then now if we had to read text that's in blue, read text in red, can we see that properly? That one, it can be dependent on your technology as well. So again, not all must-dos, but a lot of important considerations and some good best practices to keep in mind. All right. Good luck. I hope that's set some optimal practices in your head, so that when you take future classes, when you're in presentations, when you're doing presentations, you got a couple of best practices, worst practices to sort of consider when you're preparing your presentation. Thank you.